So Kahneman and Tversky started their work looking for alternatives to the rational actor model and focusing on heuristics. And then they sort of saw some patterns in their experiments, and this is grouped under the name prospect theory. Now, prospect theory is not a theory, but it's rather a inductive inductive way to view how the world works based on the evidence from their experiments. And there's two things to focus on for prospect theories. One is how some decision or prospect is framed. And is it framed in terms of losses or gains? Will I lose something or will I win something? Okay. And then the second thing is, after I've been given a prospect, is how am I going to evaluate that prospect? Am I going to look at it one way or another? So let's consider the first part is sort of the gains and losses from some reference point. And usually we think about this reference point as our status quo. So how much do I have now? So, and from a rational decision-making process, when I have $1,001, I should feel the same as a person who also has $1,001. The problem is what happens if I started with $1 and then I gained $1,000 versus a person who started with $1,000 and gained $1. You can imagine that those two individuals might think very differently, or might think of where they stand in the world very differently. Okay, so that's one thing. So thinking about where we start from the reference point. The second thing to think about is the asymmetry of losses and gains, right? So we usually overvalue our losses. And Jimmy Connors, who was a famous tennis player, summed this up as, I hate losing more than I love winning. And so let me give you a couple of examples from Kahneman and Tversky's experiments. So one is that we like to value what we have more. And so here's an experiment, and there's a group of people in a room, and they were asked, do you want a pen to go home with, or do you want a cup? And 50% of the people preferred the pen, and 50% of the people preferred the mug. Then these things were distributed randomly across the room. So some people received the mug, some people received the pen, but it's not necessarily the thing they wanted. Then after they received the item, they had an opportunity to trade, but only 10% of the people actually traded. And so even though people ended up with cups they didn't want initially, or pens they didn't want initially, once they had it, they didn't really like the idea of losing that item. And we call that thing the endowment effect. And the endowment effect is we do not like to give things up, right? And so it is more painful to give up an asset like a pen or a coffee mug than it is pleasurable to buy it, right? And this is sort of contrary to what we think in economic theory, where we set our selling prices higher than buying prices, and that creates an inefficiency in markets. This is also summarized by the status quo bias, where we generally want things to stay the same. And even though I could trade my pen for a mug, and I initially preferred the mug, I don't necessarily want to upset the status quo. Okay. The other aspect of this is whether we are in gains or losses. So in the poll I asked you to do, I asked you whether you preferred an opportunity to win $3,000 with certainty, or an 80% chance of winning $4,000. Now, according to expected utility, this is worth $3,000 because you get to $3,000 with certainty times 100%. And this is worth $3,200. That's the worst three ever, but $3,200. And so the gamble here is actually higher in terms of your expected utility. Over time, you would win more money by taking the gamble. But most people pick this. And why is that? Well, we're thinking about this as winning something, so we have evaluated this in terms of gains. And when we evaluate things in terms of gains, we tend to pick the more certain or the less risky option. And this $3,000 here is the less risky option. Okay. But what happens when I asked you whether you rather lose $3,000 or take some chance of 80% chance of losing $4,000, meaning that you have some 20% chance of losing zero, right? And what do people pick that? Well, I mean, in terms of expected utility theory, we would expect, again, to actually lose this option, to lose the $3,000 with certainty, because that is the least amount of losses over time. But people generally take the gamble and are willing to take the risk of losing $3,200 in expectation because they are thinking of this in terms of losses. And losses lead people to take more risky decisions. Right? And this is sort of, there's a lot of sort of jargon here, but what to take away from this is whether you are in gains or losses from some reference point, right? And if you're in gains, you tend to be more risk averse, meaning that you are not likely to take risks. And if you're in a domain of losses, you are more likely to be risk acceptant, meaning you're willing to take chances, right? And I'm going to show you a graph of what this means. Okay, so here on the y-axis is your, whether you, how much you value something. So up here, I value something very highly. Here, I am, very unhappy. And then here on the x-axis is what I am gaining or losing. So I've gained some item, I've gained twice that item, 3 times that item, 4 times that item. Or I've lost some item, I lost 2 of those items, 3 of those items, and so on. So what do we can look for this? Well, according to rational actor model or expected utility theory, is our gains and losses should be evaluated evenly, right? If I gain 1, I should feel as happy in the inverse to if I lost 1. And that's what this black line is telling me. That's why it's a straight 45-degree line, right? What does prospect theory tell us? It tells us, one, that we like the gain stuff. Okay, that's not surprising. But that utility actually decreases marginally over time. So I'm not as happy as I would be in terms of expected utility would expect me to be. Okay, so that's one thing. The second thing is when I lose something, oh my gosh, do I hate that, right? So here is how much I hate losing things. And that loss, this is again, how upset I am by losing 1 item. So this is losing $1, losing a ham sandwich, losing whatever. That dislike of that is so much larger than the pleasure of gaining that one thing. And again, that is very steep and much steeper than what I would expect from the expected utility. So there's this asymmetry in how much I value losses and gains. And again, I hate losing more than I like winning. And the second thing is how do I act when I'm in those regions? When I'm in the gains, when I'm winning things, when I've gained $1, gained a ham sandwich, gained whatever, I am more risk averse. And when I've lost something, I am risk seeking or risk acceptant, more willing to take on risks. So how things I view things are going to change how I view my decision making, because my risk acceptance is different, right? And so how things are framed, whether they're framed as gaining things or losing things, are going to change my decision making process. Even though the decision making process doesn't really change, it's just the way that I think about the decision making changes, which changes the way I make decisions. So let me again go back to some examples from the poll I asked you to do. So here's two programs. You can adopt program A, and 200 people will be saved. Saving, this is the framing, this is a gain. And if program B, right, I can take some risk. If I take that risk, there's a 1/3 probability that 600 people will be saved, right? You can think of this as the entire population. Or a 2/3 probability that no one would be saved. So we're in a domain of gains, and so our expectation should be that we're more likely to take the risk-averse option, right? The option with more certainty, and that's exactly what happens. Now here's an alternative way to frame it. This is the same exact problem from before, but instead of saving people, we're killing them, right? So if we adopt program C, 400 people will die. So instead of saving 200 people, we've now killed 400 people. And if we pick program D, there's a 1/3 probability that no one will die, and a 2/3 probability that 600 people will die. Now, all of those programs have the exact same expected utility. But here, when we're talking about dying, we're in a domain of losses, and people are more likely to adopt the program D, the more risk acceptance program. Okay, so prospect theory suggests that prospects can be framed in different ways, such as gains and losses, and whether we are in gains or losses are going to affect the way that we view those gains. We hate losing more than we like winning. It also changes the way we view probability decisions, that we are more likely to want to adopt risk acceptant behavior rather than risk averse behavior. Now, why would that matter? Well, let's go all the way back to the bargaining model of war. And so we had some range, which we call the bargaining range, right? And that was a function of my probability of winning times some benefit minus my costs. And here we have the other side for state B. Well, as a state becomes more and more risk acceptance, that range is going to go to the right and for state A, and to the left for state B. And that is going to close the bargaining range, and it gives states less and less options to find a negotiated settlement, right? So under the bargaining model of war, if states are risk acceptant, they are more likely to not find a solution preferable to war. These are just some more examples from Kahneman and Tversky. I'm going to kind of skip through these. There is this idea of sunk costs, right? If you, let's say you get that ham sandwich you really wanted from Subway, and you bite into it, and it's the worst sandwich you ever had. You've already paid for it. You're not getting your money back. What do? The rational person would just dump it in the garbage, because why would you want to eat a sandwich that tastes terrible? But a lot of people will eat it because they think about it in terms of, I paid for it, I should go ahead and eat it. Or think about it as a bad movie. You paid for the movie, you're sitting in the movie theater, you realize it's a bad movie. Do you sit through it? You would rather do anything else at that moment, but because you paid for it, a lot of people will endure that. And you can think about that as a lot of policies for international relations reflect that too. So say like, we spent a lot of money in Afghanistan already, so we better stick with it. Or we spent a lot of money in Iraq, so we better make sure that, you know, nothing else happens. But that's the wrong way of thinking about it, because we're not getting that money back, right? In order to make that a good decision, we just think about it as, am I making the right decision at this moment moving forward? And I can't think about all those things I spent already, because I'm not getting that money back. Okay, so I'm just gonna skip through this. Why does this matter? Okay, well, one thing you could think about it is, if one state gains territory from another, right? And I'm thinking about, we got France and we have Germany, and the Franco-Prussian War, 1870, right? Germany gains part of France, and they gain Alsace-Lorraine, right? A little piece of territory. France is really upset, and that's all they think about for 40 years until World War I, right? And they're thinking, we lost this territory, and we're more willing to take risky behavior in order to recoup these losses. So let's fight Germany. And Germany hears of this and says, I think France wants to fight over Alsace-Lorraine. But Alsace-Lorraine is now part of Germany. And so Germany starts to think about the possibility of losing Alsace-Lorraine. And Germany then is more willing to take risk acceptant behavior. So now you have two states viewing the same territory as a loss, right? France actually lost Alsace-Lorraine, and Germany is thinking of expecting to lose Alsace-Lorraine. So both states are in the domain of losses. Both states are more willing to take risky behavior, right? And this is kind of the understanding that we should start taking to international relations, right? So having an understanding of how human behavior works. This is just one way to look at it. It's definitely not the definitive way to look at it. If you look at the political psych literature, there's a lot of disagreement about the validity of prospect theory and what we should do with it. But it does have some intuitive sense, because it seems to map onto how our behavior works on a day-to-day basis. Okay. So psychology approaches in IR is growing. I would recommend seeing works by Josh Kurtzer or Justin Tingley. They have a lot of interesting work on psychology approaches in IR. This is kind of needed because we don't have good understanding of why people join terrorist organizations, or why people become suicide bombers, or why people become radicals or extremists. It's also interesting to note that our evidence suggests that people don't really follow economic self-interest. Brexit wasn't really about how do I personally benefit from Brexit, but more about sociotropic preferences about race and immigration. So we should have a better understanding of that. And we should probably have a better understanding of the personality traits as leaders as predictors of behavior, right? And so instead of having these large theories like realism or liberalism to explain a small number of events, we might want to, focus on a large number of decisions, right? And thinking about how decision makers actually make decisions. This can be applied to different events. So FDR viewed World War II as a loss before the US entered, and therefore was more apt to engage in risky behavior, specifically the Lend-Lease Agreement with the UK and the embargo on Japan. In the Iranian hostage situation, Jimmy Carter asked for options on how to save the hostages in Iran, and essentially they were going to try to sort of military rescue, and the person in charge of the mission said the probability of success is 0 and the risks are high. But Jimmy Carter was in the domain of losses, right? He was about to lose an election. He lost the hostages. And so he was willing to take on a risk that essentially had no chance of working, right? And we can think of other reasons why states would be in a domain of losses: lost war, lost territory, lost prestige, a position of power, possibly economic crises from what we're about to see from the COVID virus, right? I talked about Germany and France. Japan was in a position of losing power in the Pacific War, in the Pacific region, to the US. And there's many other ways in which states might engage in this type of behavior. So what do we do with this? So one would be, how does this change the way we think about this? So critics would say that all of this is great, but it's all found within lab settings, not necessarily within the real world. And this comes down to internal versus external validity problems. External validity means that our data does not necessarily map onto the real world. So when you ask college students to participate in these types of experiments, do they really reflect like how decision makers, leaders make decisions, right? Because people need to get more incentives to get the right answers because international relations has such high stakes, right? And it seems that people act more rational when they are under high stakes or sort of high stress situations. Right? The other problem is that prospect theory lacks a theory of aggregation. So what happens if you are in a room full of people operating under prospect theory? Do we assume that the whole room, the whole decision-making process or body is actually working under prospect theory? What happens if we're playing a strategic game against someone with prospect theory? How does that work? And then how do we know what our reference points are? Are we at zero? Are we at a status quo? Those are things that are difficult to determine. From my own standpoint, I think these are issues that, these critiques that we should be taken seriously. But I think there's been some important inroads in the political psych literature related to international relations that deserves wide attention. But I don't think we're ready to jettison what we've learned so far this semester about how we apply sort of general strategic behavior to IR.